You know, I get oddly excited anytime I see Stephen Ogg signed on to a project, mainly because I think any script could use a Trevor in it. Snowpiercer is a tale of what happens when global warming fucks up the world. That's essentially it. Some scientists try to mess around with global warming, mess with the ozone layer, internal winter ensues, and the survivors of humanity have to all board a train that just keeps circling around, and that's what's left of humanity. Now, the interesting thing is that the train is broken up into different classes, kind of like feudalism. You got your rich class, you got your, I guess, for lack of a better term, secondary class. These are your brakemen or your security, your armed forces, your whatever. And then next you have the working class. And under them is what's known as the tailies. The tailies is a group that got onto the train without permission and is basically in prison in the back of the train, hoping to start a Viva Revolution and make their way up to the front and take over the train for themselves. And honestly, I really enjoyed this one. So I think the main reason that kept me hooked is that I know some reviews online. I did the unthinkable. I actually read some reviews, but some people say that the show is kind of boring, where it doesn't get good until the end. I disagree. I don't think there's a boring episode here. Because the way I see it, the show is breaking up into different arcs. You have your first bit, which is more of like a noir kind of detective story, where a tailie, our main character, is pulled from the tale to go and investigate a murder. And that's pretty interesting because you end up actually seeing this character who's basically below dirt. He's basically the lowest of the lows. Most people would prefer if they just drop dead. This character with basically no class starting to interact with people, and he starts to, some characters he starts to actually build up rapport with, and it's actually really cool to see. And there's that dynamic in the show again where everyone's divided, but then when it comes down to it, there are characters who don't subscribe to that, at least after interacting with people who are deemed lesser than them. And this whole season is basically just a huge build-up to a revolution that happens towards the end. Without spoiling anything, that's as far as I'll go with that. But yeah, no, but the players in this are actually pretty interesting. You have Melanie Cavill, played by Jennifer Connelly, name here, who's, for lack of a better term, she's basically the big bad for this season, or the main bad guy. But she doesn't come off as a bad guy per se. It really depends on how you look at it. It's one of those open-ended things where, yeah, she does some pretty horrible shit. You know, a couple people lose their arms, some people die, she may or may not be hiding a secret from the rest of the train. Everything she does is for, in her mind, the betterment of the train. She's a perfect example of the old expression, no one's the villain in their own story. And the fun thing is, there's other characters throughout the series who play smaller roles who end up getting their own development. And it feels like everybody gets enough screen time to improve their characters. Like, for example, John Osweiler, played by Sam Otto, is a character who basically uses his position as a brakeman or security to basically get favors and to sell drugs and stuff like that. And you see his development throughout the series, and it's interesting because he's one of those characters where it looks like he's starting to get better, then he takes a dive, and it's almost like a failed redemption arc. Again, don't worry, I'm not spoiling anything. And it's very interesting because it's rather than just taking a character and just being like, he's a shitbag, you show he actually has redeeming qualities. And then you see that those redeeming qualities may not outweigh his shitty qualities. That always somehow find their way back up. And that's one of the appeal when it comes to the characters in the show, is that they all feel real. Like, some of the dialogue in the show can be a little weird, but other than that, I feel like the characters, most if not all the characters are relatable in some sense. And the big thing I gotta praise the show for is world building. As I said before, the class divide. I feel like this show wasted absolutely no time in the first season building that world, showing how the tailies, like the prisoners in the back, have to kind of forage and have to ration everything they get. And then you have the people in the third class, who are the working class, who may or may not have some gang organizations floating around in the background. And even they're not happy with their position and they're trying to jockey up and maybe move up the second. Then you have the second class who are more content, the more, I guess, trying to keep the train in line per se. And then you have the first class who are basically just whining about the other classes. The world building and the characters themselves made it so that I never felt bored throughout the show. However, if I were to say one negative thing, it's actually not the character development themselves, but the development in relationships. I find that's a little rushed. Like, there are certain characters in the show who you're like, okay, so they're seeing each other, that's neat. I don't know what their chemistry is, but that's cool. I mean, sometimes, and again, this show, from the first episode when it shows them boarding the train, there's a 6-year time skip. So I do kind of appreciate the fact that some relationships are already developed, and they don't have to, they basically don't shove it in our face that, oh, here's how these characters got together. Oh, here's how these characters got their feelings for each other. I get that, but at the same time, it's like some of these, I'm like, I know you guys really like each other, but I don't know why. And I'm not just talking about romantic relationship. There's some like friendship or kinship relationships in the show where I'm just like, I wish you would have fleshed it out a little more. I mean, the only relationships I've really been invested with is the main character and one of them in the main brakeman. I think those two, when they're trying to solve the murder together, that's the only relationship I'm really like, these guys are bros now. But that's honestly a small complaint in the large scheme of the show. Also, David Diggs, the guy who plays Leighton, the main character, is great casting. I think he's great in the role. I didn't say that earlier. So there he is. And again, this kind of goes to testament where, like, I feel like every character they casted the perfect character for that role. And they even found room to fit a Stephen Ogg's character in this. Because again, I like the guy. It might sound like a dig, but like, he basically only plays Trevor or just an angry dude. But still, I love it. Anyway, so my verdict is, if you haven't seen this, you should watch it. I know online it seems to be a little more divisive, more on the positive side, but it's still divisive. I think it's a good drama, if nothing else. Yeah, that's it for me. I'm excited for the second season. Hopefully it comes out within the next year and it doesn't do the Altered Carbon route and come out like years later and the second season ends up being complete trash like Altered Carbon. But anyway, my hate for Altered Carbon aside, it's been me, Benny B. You've been awesome, and shave your head.